Welcome to Rita's Roost and the Quilted Chicken Farm. Well, it's our story time, and we're in chapter 8 of the Persian Pickle Club by Sandra Dallas. Let me get comfortable here. I'm going to put my feet up in this other stool. I'm sitting in one, I'm going to put my feet on the other one while I read to you. Here goes. Chapter 8. It it sure is dark, Rita said as I turned onto the section road. Are you sure you've got your brights on? She shivered a little and asked me to roll up the window part way. I switched the headlights to dim and back to bright again. There was no moon and we couldn't see the stars because of the clouds. Not rain clouds, just those empties Grover talks about. The black Kansas night the, the black Kansas night might bother a city person like Rita, who likes street lamps and neon signs, but I was a country girl, so the dark was a friend to me. I yawned. It'll be 11 o'clock before we get home. What will Grover say? Rita turned on the radio and moved the dial around until she found a Kansas City station playing Paper Moon. She put her head on the back of the seat and hummed along with it, then laughed. If I live here for the rest of my life, God forbid, I'll never get used to going to bed with the chickens. Tom and I always stayed up until 2 or 3 on Friday and Saturday nights and slept till noon the next day. Of course, with my job, we never got to sleep before midnight even during the week. If Dad knew how late we'd stayed up, he'd call us slothful. You know, he's even against playing cards. Imagine. Most people around here are. Cards and dancing. Grover's dad said it was just an excuse for a boy to hold a girl in his arms. Well, he's right about that, we both giggled. I stopped and looked both ways when we reached the crossroads. Although I knew there wasn't a car within 5 miles of us, the people who'd gone to see the picture show at the home and feed had been in bed for hours, and I'd be surprised if we passed a single car all the way home. As I turned onto the highway, I finished rolling up my window, thinking I was glad for the chill in the air. I wouldn't miss this summer. All of a sudden, Rita screamed, "My God, look out, Queenie!" I slammed on the brakes and skidded across the dirt, stopping no more than a yard in front of something big and black that was lying across the road. If Rita hadn't spotted it in time, we'd have run into it for sure, wrecking the car. This was indeed a time for troubles, and I shuddered when I thought of Rita and me lying there on the road, dead, with Grover at home waiting for me. "Damn it," Rita said, "that was close. What the hell is that?" "Darned if I know." We got out of the car together and walked to a log as big as a telephone pole that was lying crossways in the road. "It must have fallen off a truck," Rita said. I shook my head back and forth, getting madder with each shake as I thought how dangerous that log was. Anybody who lost a load like that would have felt it roll off the truck. He should have stopped and moved it. Why, we could have been killed, Rita. Grover will find out who did it, and boy, will he be sorry. I leaned over to see if I could heft one end of the log and was about to ask Rita if she would pick up the other when she said under her breath, "Something's not right here. Quick, Queenie, get back in the car." I straightened up to ask her what the hurry was, and just as I did so, a man loomed up out of the ditch next to us. I opened my mouth to ask for his aid, but before I could utter a word, I knew he wasn't there to help us. That log hadn't fallen off a truck by accident. "Rita," I said. She dashed for the car, but stopped when she heard me call. When she turned and saw the big shape in the dark, she froze. Rita hadn't actually seen the man until that moment. She'd just had a creepy feeling something was wrong. I willed myself to run to the car, but my feet wouldn't move. As if to make up for it, the rest of my body shook, a little at first, then harder as I watched the man come toward me, real deliberate, like he was walking in slow motion in the movies. He stopped just as he reached the headlight. I could smell him as much as I could see him, a moldy smell like rotted manure, and his breath was as foul as old onions. I didn't smell any liquor, however, and even then I thought it was odd that I'd noticed such a thing. My mind was working even though my body wasn't. He took a step closer, moving across the beam of the headlight, and I saw he was big, almost as big as Grover, with mean eyes and fat lips. For a few seconds I tried to convince myself he'd come to help, but Rita knew better. "Get away, you," she said. He waved a hand at her the way a person does at a snapping little dog. "Give me your keys right now," he ordered me. He didn't act as if he'd been drinking, which scared me more than ever because I'd rather humor a drunk than match wits with a sober man. "Go to hell," Rita said. "You go to effing hell." I've never heard anybody say that word, but if it worked, I'd use it myself. "Shut up, you," he snarled at Rita. He was still looking at me, however. "I don't have any keys," I whispered. What I meant was I'd left the keys in the car. The man took a step toward me and grabbed my hand, prying open my fingers to see if I was lying. The touch of his rough skin against mine felt worse than his fingernails digging into my palm. "They're in the car," I said. My voice worked about as well as my feet. "The keys, I left them in the car." The man didn't seem to be in such a rush now. With an ugly smile, he looked at Rita, then back at me. He held tightly to my hand, held it still while the rest of me shook so hard I thought I'd fall down if he let go. Two women, out here alone in a nice big car. Well now, his eyes gleamed in the car lights. I glanced at Rita, who opened her mouth to speak, but licked her lips instead. I was grateful she kept silent because cursing him hadn't done any good. "Our husbands are expecting us. They'll be here any minute," I said. "They're following us." "I guess I don't see no automobile lights coming." His short laugh was like a coyote bark. I thought if I moved real slow I might be able to pull my hand away. But when I tried, he gripped my wrist so hard that my hand went numb. "You can have the car. It has a radio. Grover put it in," I said. "He's a real fighter. You better get going before he comes because he'll beat you up." By now I didn't care if the man drove off, and I never saw the Studebaker again. All I wanted was for him to take his dry, hard hand off my wrist and leave us, but he just held on to me. "You've got nice brown hair. I like that. I never was partial to yellow-headed women," he said. He reached up with his free hand and stroked my hair. His touch felt like a hot iron pressed against my skull, and I yanked my head away. He slapped me across the face with the back of his hand, then hit me again with his palm. "No," Rita said, "don't you hurt her." "Behave, both of you," he growled, rubbing his scaly fingers over my wrist. He made a fist with his free hand and shook it at Rita. She watched him with hard little eyes. Suddenly, she yanked off her shoe and flew toward him, hitting his arm with the sharp heel. "You son of a... let her go." Her blows didn't hurt him any more than a horsefly bite. Still holding on to my wrist, the man slapped Rita, knocking her down in the road. "You stay there, Blondie, unless you want a good kick," he ordered. I looked at his thick lace boots and hoped Rita would do what he said. He turned back to me. "Okay, girlie, me and you are going for a ride now. Maybe we'll have us some fun." Until that moment, I hadn't even thought about the man taking me with him. Now my stomach churned so hard I was afraid I would throw up. "Oh, no, please," I begged. "You can have the car. I won't tell anybody. My purse is in there. You can have it, too. There's $4 in it. Take it. I won't tell nobody, not even Grover. I promise." The man didn't reply. Instead, he moved right up next to me and rubbed his stubby face against mine. His whiskers raked across my skin, and as he turned his mouth toward me, I felt something cold. It was drool. He looked away and looked at me again, licking the wet off out of the corner of his mouth, and he yanked me toward the car door. I tried to reach up so I could scratch him with my free hand, but he batted it away. "I told you, behave," he said, stopping to look me up and down again. All of a sudden he reached over and squeezed my breast, wringing it so hard that I cried out from pain. I prayed for Grover to come and save me, or for God to kill me before he did what I knew he would do. Rita had moved to a crouch and was ready to spring at him, but he raised his foot at her and said, "You move and I'll hurt your friend bad." "Don't," I whispered to him. My teeth chattered. Now he was angry. "What's the matter, girlie? Ain't I good enough for you? You rich ladies think you're better'n me." He put his hand on the neck of my dress and ripped it all the way down to my waist. The tear made a sound like fingernails on glass, and it was loud. My ears ached so loud that surely Grover must have heard it. The man put his hand on my throat and moved it down over my body. "You're real soft. You be nice to me, and I'll be nice to you. Me and you's going to have us a real good time." I began to sob, not just because I knew what he would do, but because at that instant I saw the shape of a second man coming out of the darkness. He would grab Rita. There was no hope that Rita and I would get away from the two men. Both of us would be raped. I turned the ugly word over in my mind and felt it stick in my throat. "Please," I cried. "Oh, please, if you need money, you need help?" The shape in the dark asked softly. His voice was so quiet that the man holding me didn't even hear him. "I ask if you need help," he said a little louder. The man dropped my wrist as if it were a hot stove lifter and spun around. My legs gave out and I fell into the dirt next to Rita. As I sprawled there, relief spread over me as surely as if I'd been covered up with a soft quilt. "It's all right," I whispered to Rita, whose face was as white as flour. "It's Blue Massey." Rita grabbed my hand, the one the man had held, and I winced, but I held on to her. "Mind your business," the man snarled at Blue, flicking his hand at him to make him go away. "By doggies, I reckon this here is my business," Blue replied in the same gentle voice. He talked as quietly as a person making mail-time conversation at the post office. The man laughed at Blue, sizing him up. He must have thought because Blue was a head shorter and slight of build that he'd be as easy to overpower as Rita and I were. But Blue was wiry and strong. He was a dirty fighter, the way the hill people are. The man swung, but before he could land a single punch, Blue slammed him in the face with his fist, making a sound like a sledgehammer on a hogshead at slaughter time. There was the crackle of bone breaking. The man howled with pain and took a step backwards. Blue wasn't finished with him. When the man put his hands to his face, Blue kicked him in the groin. Blue was barefoot, but his foot was as hard as walnut, and the man doubled over. He dropped his hands to the front of his pants, and I saw the blood gush out of his nose. He turned to run, but Blue kicked him in the small of his back. The man made a whoop sound and limped off into the dark. Blue let him go, and I was glad. I didn't ever want to see him again. Blue watched, making sure he was gone for good before he turned to me, his breath coming as easy as if he'd been out for a walk. "You all right, missus?" "Oh, Blue, I prayed somebody would help us." I began to cry again and reached into my pocket for a handkerchief. I realized then that my dress was ripped open, so I clutched it closed, and Blue looked away. "Where did you come from?" Rita asked. Her voice was high and shaky as she cleared her throat. Blue took off his cap and held it in his hands, then squatted down next to us, sitting on his haunches. "Well, I tell you, Zelpha, she's been itchy all day. She didn't know what it was, but she knowed it had something to do with you, missus. She tried to conjure it away, but it wouldn't go. So she knowed it was powerful. We were already in bed when she says, 'Go look over the bean place.' I didn't see nothing at the house, so I went down the edge of the field and chanced to see the lights of your car." "My God, what if you hadn't come along?" Rita said. "No such thing," Blue chuckled softly. I'd have come directly. Zelpha knows her signs right real good, that one." I got up slowly, clutching my ripped dress and with one hand and holding on to the car with the other. My wrist ached from where the man had held it, and my fingers tingled. My face hurt from the slaps, and where he had touched it, my breast felt raw. Blue helped Rita up. She had torn her dress when she fell down, and her hose were ripped. Her shoe was still in her hand, but it took too much effort to put it on, so she carried it. We held on to each other as we went to the car because I don't think either of us could have stood alone. Thank you, Blue, Rita whispered. Blue nodded, shifting from one foot to the other, not sure what to do. I'll move that log out of the road, then I'll be getting on. No, Rita and I cried together. What if he comes back? Rita asked. Blue shook his head. No cause to worry. That one ain't going to bother nobody for a long time. I can't drive, Blue. My hands are shaking too much, I said. Will you drive us to the Ritters? I'll call Grover and he'll come and get me. Before Blue ducked his head, I saw he was pleased to be asked. He maneuvered the log into the ditch. Then the three of us got into the front seat of the car, with me in the middle. Rita locked all the doors and moved in close against me. Tears ran down her face as we drove to the Ritter farm, and every now and then she let out a little hiccup. When Blue pulled up by the back door, Tom heard the motor and rushed outside. He had just phoned Nettie to ask when we'd be home, and she'd told him we'd been gone for nearly an hour. Tom was wondering whether to call Grover. Then we drove up. When he saw Blue in the driver's seat, Tom jumped the porch rail, landing next to the car. What happened? He asked. The women's all right, but they sure had a scare, Blue said, getting out of the car. Tom yanked open the passenger door, and Rita fell into his arms. Tom picked her up and started for the house, then remembered me. Queenie? Help me, Tom, I whispered. I slid out of the car and clutched his arm with both my hands. I couldn't have walked to the house without him. We had reached the porch steps before I remembered Blue and turned back to the car. He was not there. Blue? I called, but there was no answer in the darkness. Blue Massey was gone. Tom phoned Grover and asked him to come and get me, telling him I'd had car trouble. He said that so Grover wouldn't be alarmed. But he also didn't want people to know what had happened. A call that late at night got everybody out of bed to find out what was going on, and most of them had been listening in earlier when Tom called Nettie to ask where we were. Even if folks didn't know about the man on the road, Rita and I were going to be the talk of Harveyville for staying out so late. After he hung up, Mrs. Ritter, who heard the commotion, came down the stairs to the kitchen where we were waiting for Grover. My stars, she said when she saw Rita and me sitting at the table, holding on to each other. Reaching across the oilcloth, Mrs. Ritter took the shoe out of Rita's hand and dropped it on the floor. She removed a sweater from a hook by the back door and handed it to me so I could cover my ripped dress. Mrs. Ritter rubbed her eyes on the sleeve of her bathrobe before she stirred up the fire in the cook stove and put on water for tea. Then she bustled around the kitchen, setting out bread and a dish of butter. When there's trouble, women just naturally think of food, although there was no need for it this time. My throat was so tight I couldn't eat a bite, and the way she kept swallowing, I knew Rita couldn't either. By the time Mrs. Ritter sat down at the table with us, Grover was at the door. The minute I saw Grover, I was embarrassed and turned away from him, refusing to look him in the eye. I was glad the sweater covered up my torn dress because I was so ashamed. Some man out on the road stopped them, Tom started to explain. Rita and I had told Tom only a little of what had happened to us. Grover put up his hand and Tom stopped. Are you all right, Queenie? Grover asked. I nodded, my eyes on my lap where my hands twitched just as Ella's had earlier that day. Look at me, Queenie, Grover said softly. I raised my head as slowly as I could, glancing at him, then turning to the stove where the tea kettle was boiling. I couldn't stand to look at Grover while he studied me. He said a cuss word when he saw my swollen face. I knew he had already taken in my ripped dress and the scratches on my legs. I waited for him to speak, hoping he wouldn't be cross with me for driving so late at night, even though I could not have left Nettie's any earlier. I laid the blame for what happened upon myself after what Rita and I had been through. However, I couldn't stand to have Grover fuss at me. Queenie, are you sure you're all right? Grover asked again. Yes, I said in a squeaky voice. He didn't have time. "Oh, Jesus," Grover said with that what sounded like a sob, and grabbed me out of my chair. He hugged me so hard I could barely breathe. Then he sat down and pulled me onto his lap, and I looked up at him. There were tears in his eyes. I'd never seen Grover cry, even when I lost the baby. "Are you sure he—" Grover swallowed hard and didn't finish, but I knew what he was asking. "No, Blue stopped him," I said. "Wait a minute, I forgot about him. Was that hired man in on this?" Tom asked. "Oh, no," I said quickly. "Blue saved us. If he hadn't come along then. Isn't that right, Rita?" Rita didn't answer. Instead, she put her head down on the kitchen table and began to cry. Tom patted her back, and Rita sat up and threw her arms around him. "I hate this stinking place, Tom. I hate it. It never felt safe. I'll never feel safe here again after this ugly thing. I swear to God, Tom, I'd sell my soul to get off this damn farm." I glanced at Mrs. Ritter, but there was nothing in her face except sympathy. She got up from her chair and filled the teapot with boiling water, let it steep, and poured the tea into 4 cups, which she set on the table. Then she hugged Rita and me and patted Tom's arm. "I'll let you young folks be alone. There's no need to tell Dad or Agnes till morning." I waited until I heard the bedroom door close. Then I started at the beginning, telling Tom and Grover everything that had happened. When I finished, Grover hit the table with his fist. "That son of a... When I catch him, I swear I'll pull out his nuts with pliers." "Save one of them for me," Tom told him. Rita hadn't said a word since Mrs. Ritter went to bed. She just sat there stirring her tea with her finger, Tom's arms still around her. "Honey, are you okay?" he asked. Rita didn't answer or even nod. She licked her fingertips, and suddenly she said to me, "Was that Skillet? That man? Was he Skillet?" "Skillet?" Tom asked. "Who's Skillet?" "Ben Crook's old hired man," Grover explained, a puzzled look on his face. "He hadn't been around in a year, maybe more. Was it him, Queenie?" "No, it wasn't Skillet," I said. "I'd have known Skillet. It was a tramp." "Are you sure?" Rita asked. "I'm sure. Skillet had a face like a wedge of pumpkin pie. This man's face was round. I shuddered when I pictured him. He had a lot of hair, too. Skillet was almost bald." "What made you think it was Skillet?" Tom asked. He let go of Rita long enough to sip his tea. Then he put his arm around her shoulder again. "Because somebody's out to get me, Queenie and me," she replied. "I'm sure of it." I sucked in my breath. He wasn't anybody I ever saw. He was a drifter. How would he have known we were coming along? Even with the sweater on, I began shivering again, thinking that man might have been waiting for just the 2 of us. "I don't think so, Queenie," Rita said slowly. I think it has to do with "I don't think so, Queenie," Rita said slowly. "I think it has to do with Ben Crook's murder. Somebody's trying to stop us from finding out who did it. And whoever he was, he knew we were at Nettie's tonight. Who wasn't with that party line, so he waited for us. He meant to kill us." "Honey, it was just a coincidence. He was a tramp," Tom said, squeezing her and giving her a kiss on the side of her head. "Maybe so, but it wouldn't hurt to mention it to the sheriff," Grover said. I was shocked. "Oh, no, Grover, we can't tell. I don't want anybody to know about this." I still sat on Grover's lap, and he put his chin on the top of my head. "Queenie, if we don't tell the sheriff, then the man who tried to hurt you will go after somebody else, and you wouldn't want that to happen, would you?" "But I can't talk about this, Grover. I just can't," I said. "I want to go home now." I tried to stand up, but my legs wobbled, so Grover picked me up, and after Rita and I hugged each other, Grover carried me to the truck. "What if Zelpha hadn't had a presentiment?" I asked him as we drove home. "What if Blue hadn't come along?" "You can't worry about what didn't happen," Grover said, drawing me close to him. "Do you think that man was after Rita and me because of Ben Crook, or maybe for some other reason?" "Nah," Grover said a little too fast. "It was just bad luck." He stopped the truck next to the back door, and our dog came out to greet us, wagging his tail. You know, Queenie, it wouldn't hurt if you let old Bob keep you company around the house for a while. In the morning, Grover drove Rita and Tom and me into Harveyville to report to Sheriff Eagles. Rita believes this attack might have something to do with her investigating Ben Crook's murder, Tom said after we told what had happened. I think he wanted to scare us off, keeping us from solving the murder, Rita added, maybe even kill us. The sheriff mulled that over. I thought you said Queenie was the one who got pawed. Sheriff Eagles turned red and looked down at his hands, which were folded in front of him like a little church. He was behind his desk while Rita and I were on the same straight chairs we'd sat in during Rita's interview the day before. Grover and Tom stood because there weren't any more chairs. What difference does that make? Maybe he didn't know which was Rita and which was Queenie, Tom said. The sheriff shrugged and told Rita, if you think this has something to do with Ben, maybe you ought to back off and leave finding criminals to the law. It ain't worth you getting killed over. No, sir, he's not stopping me, Rita said, leaning forward and looking at the sheriff with fire in her eyes. Queenie and I are going to solve this murder no matter what. Nobody's going to threaten us. She turned to me to agree with her, but I shook my head no. Not me, Rita, not now. I don't care who killed Ben. Rita was disappointed. Still, she wouldn't give up. Well, it doesn't matter. If I have to do it all by myself, I will. What do you think, Sheriff? Tom asked. Does it sound to you like this has something to do with Ben? Maybe the man was that skillet fellow after all. Nope, the sheriff said. He turned over his hands to see all the people, inspecting his fingers before he took out his pocket knife and cut off a dried blister. Queenie knows Skillet. Besides, I already got a pretty good idea who it was stopped you ladies out there on the road. Then for God's sake, why don't you arrest him? Tom asked. If you don't, Grover and I'll find him. You do that. It'll save me the trouble. The sheriff's chair squeaked as he leaned back and looked up at Tom and Grover. I didn't say I had his name and his address. I just know there's a man who did the same thing over in Osage County last week and in Leavenworth a week or two before that. I got a report about him. You girls are lucky that hired man of yours came along when he did. The sheriff licked his lip, but before he could continue, Grover interrupted. There's no need to go into the details. This isn't gangbusters, you know. I was just going to tell you he was over in Missouri before that, the sheriff finished. He moves around a good bit, so I expect he's hightailed it out of Wabassee County by now. Grover nodded. Whoever he was, he won't be coming around here for a long time. After what Blue did to him, I doubt if he can stand up straight. I wondered if Grover said that for my sake or the sheriff's. When Rita and I got up, the sheriff stood too and came out from behind his desk to shake our hands. I sure am sorry about this, ladies. A man's got no right. He blushed and turned away. If you catch sight of him again, you let me know. If they see him again, we'll let you know where to pick up the pieces, Grover told him. On the way home, Grover said he'd treat the four of us to Coney Islands in a moving picture show in Topeka that night. But I still couldn't eat, and said I didn't feel like going to the movies, even if it was top hat. Grover was being awful nice to me because he didn't like pictures with singing and dancing, but he knew I did. Rita said she'd rather stay home too. She told us she had work to do, and when she said it, her eyes were as hard and as mean as those of the man on the road. Word got around about what had happened to Rita and me, of course, and the members of the Persian Pickle Club stopped in at our place with their potato salads and burnt sugar cakes, their prettiest scraps of material and words of concern. I felt better knowing how much they cared, and I felt safer sitting in the rocker with old Bob at my side while they clucked about me like I was a chick and they were biddies. They called to Rita too and said how glad they were that she was all right, and when she explained to them the man had been waiting on the road just for us, they shook their heads and told her to forget about Ben Crook. No matter who killed Ben, dearie. Catching him isn't worth you and Queenie getting hurt. Sarah said for all of them. That didn't deter Rita. She kept on trying to solve the crime. Sometimes she talked about it as we sat and stitched in the afternoon. I quilted because it was the most comforting thing I knew to do. Rita sewed, too, not because it steadied her nerves, but because it kept her from biting her fingernails. We went over and over what had happened. We couldn't discuss it with the other Pickles because they'd changed the subject, saying we ought to forget. But Rita and I couldn't forget, and talking about the man and what Blue had done to him, wondering if he was still in a sick bed or maybe crippled for life, made him smaller and less scary. Rita was at my house the day Forrest Ann called with a pan of divinity. She told us she'd just heard some good news and had rushed over to tell us. I can't think of anything that will cheer you more, so I came directly here, she said, cutting the candy into big pieces and setting them on a plate. Rita took a piece and nibbled at it while I bit into another. With my mouth full, I raised my eyebrows to Forrest Ann to show how good it was. Forrest Ann nodded to accept the compliment. She took a piece herself but set it down so that she could talk. Just wait until you hear what I have to say. With all the bad that's been happening lately, we've had us at least one blessing. Did the sheriff find the man? I asked. Forrest Ann wiped a crumb of divinity off her mouth with the heel of her hand. No, not that. This is really good news. Tyrone's feeling stouter each and every day. Doc informed Nettie and me not more than an hour ago that Tyrone doesn't have the polio after all. Now isn't that something to be grateful for? Forrest Ann gave us such a smile of happiness that we had to smile right back at her, even though we hadn't been worrying much about Tyrone lately. After she left, Rita set her half-eaten piece of divinity back on the plate. I'd eaten all of mine and had already had heartburn. Grateful? Grateful because Nettie's husband doesn't have polio? Rita's voice was so shrill that old Bob, who was lying in the shade by the porch steps, got up and trotted over to her. Just think, Queenie, we almost got killed because that bootlegger Tyrone Burgett had an attack of rheumatism. Rita snickered. After I thought it over, I giggled. Then the two of us laughed so hard that my divinity came up and I had to swallow it back down. I think that's when I began to feel better. That's the end of chapter 8. See y'all later. You enjoyed the story?